trip. Okay. This is a trip that we took last June, the four of us. Becky and I went to Paris before this part of the trip because Becky had never been there and she wanted to have a visit. So we had a 3-day visit. But I'm not including that part in this major slideshow because a lot of people have seen the major sites one way or the other of Paris, which is what we were doing. I'm starting where we met up, where Lynn and Janet flew into to join Becky and myself. We trained across from Paris to a town called Constance with a K, which is on Lake Constance, or Bodensee, as it's called over there. And it's a huge lake bordered by Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. We were setting out on a 4-day bike trip around the biggest part of the lake. There was another end to it that we could have added to our trip, but we felt that 4 days of continuous biking in to in probably would be fine with us. After we checked into our hotel, we had dinner, and the next day they had given us free bus tickets. So we had a spare day in Constance just to regroup. We used the bus tickets to go into the center of Constance, which is a fairly old town. It managed to evade being bombed on by anybody during the war, possibly because it's right close to the Swiss border, and nobody wanted their bombs dropping by mistake on Switzerland, I guess. So it is got most of its medieval buildings still intact. Next. And this is some of the buildings and squares that we saw basically doing a sightseeing morning round the town. Next. Again, more views of the older buildings, old church. The whole centre is pedestrianised. There's an odd car you see there, but I guess they probably had business there and a permit. Again, showing some of the old buildings. You can almost see the slope of the wall, which has warped over time. And this is the old gate tower. This was the original, one of the original gates leading into the town of Constance. And it's right by, on the other side of this, is the river draining out of Lake Constance, the Rhine. Next. This is a common place for us to have lunch. We found that bakeries were a really good place to stop and get lunch. They, as you can see on the left-hand side, there's always a selection of sandwiches made up with fresh breads and buns. In the afternoon, we went to visit a big electric and regular bike rental place. It's Rad Reisen. They're a huge German company, and they have bike rentals anywhere anybody might ever want to bike, anywhere in Europe. And they're a good company. So if you're ever looking for a company in Europe to go biking, we can recommend Rad Reisen. Anyway, there they fitted us out with electric step-through electric bikes, which is what we had ordered, and rode around their courtyard just to make sure we were properly fitted. And then we took ourselves off for a short ride in the afternoon along the river to where we were going to depart in the morning, just to make sure that we had our directions correct. I might add, in and out of Constance, there are bike jams and bike paths every single direction. Next. And here is us. The next day, we actually set out on the other side of the lake. You can just see a few buildings on the other side. So we left Constance. To avoid going over a hill, we went round a peninsula, and I have to admit that my navigation had a little bit of a struggle here, and we arrived at the wrong ferry. Anyway, fortunately, we weren't that far from the right ferry because we had been provided with coupons to ferry across from the far side to this side. And as you can see, our bikes are all uniform Rad Reisen's e-bikes with blue panniers and a front basket, standard rental fare. We're now going to be biking along the lake, mostly on a bike path. And next, some wooded areas that we went through. Next. And this is again just after we had crossed the ferry and looking at the yachting basin on Lake Constance. This is, as I say, a very big lake. Next. As we were cycling along, you can see what is an older manor type building with the vineyards in front of it. And we did pass quite a few vineyards on this day. The day, as you can see, is a little on the grey side, but it never did rain. Next. Around lunchtime, we came to the medieval small town of Meerburg, and we rode the cobbles into the centre of town here, where we were going to have lunch. Next. And this is us in the old town of Meerburg, and you can see the beautiful gateway behind us that we have just come through. We had the capacity to, we had locks, so we could park our bikes and lock them while we walked around. One of the interesting things in this town, I think it's on the next slide. Next. If you look here, there is an Pa band going. They are sort of centre back, and they were playing very traditional German Pa music. At the tables in front were clearly a tour group who'd arranged to have this, their tour director had arranged to have this band play for them during lunch. The rest of us just sort of sat around the edges to listen. Next. This was an old monastery that we passed on the way. We're on the bike path again, below the vineyards, but above the lake. Next. One of the things that we saw flying overhead were these blimps. These blimps started their history as Zeppelins. And the following morning, we were going to go and visit the Zeppelin Museum. Nobody flies around in Zeppelins anymore, not much since the Hindenburg disaster of 1937. However, they are used extensively for advertising. And there was nearly always one somewhere visible above the lake. Next. Again, more vineyards as we're going along the frontage road. As I say, they were nearly all, we were on the north side of the lake, and these are the south-facing slopes, and they all had a lot of vineyards on them. Next. Oh, that's just another one, Janet. A nice one of you.
Well, thank you.
Next. And again, just showing the kind of path that we were on. We were mostly on a dedicated bike path on this particular route until we came to the place where we were going to stay the night, a place called Friedrichshafen, where we did have to wander around some of the urban roads a little bit. We had a challenge finding our hotel, largely because there wasn't a sign on the corner from where we were on bike paths, tell us where to turn to this hotel. Anyway, we asked in another hotel and they directed us to our hotel. Next. And as I mentioned, the following morning, we went to the Zeppelin Museum and we learned all about everything of the Zeppelins, which were originally developed during the First World War for dropping things on the opposition. But after the First World War, and up until 1937, they were turned into passenger craft. And they had them flying over the Atlantic, taking 2.5 days to get from one side to the other, which was far faster than a ship even today. And of course, they didn't have jets flying, so the Hindenburg was the way to go, or the Zeppelins. They were very large, much bigger than a big 747. They had sleeping quarters in them that rather resembled railway carriage sleeping accommodations, up and down bunk kind of thing. But they also had a restaurant and a smoking room and a quiet room. They were quite substantive. In the equivalent of modern day currency, it would have cost you $14,000 to fly across the Atlantic on 2.5 days in one of these. Not this little one, but in the big ones. Janet, Lynn, can you think of anything about the museum that you'd like to add?
I would recommend that museum to everybody.
Yeah,
It was incredible what you saw in there, and
yeah,
how those people had to live in that thing for 2 days.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it was one of the most interesting I'd been in for a long time as a museum. Uh, anyway, after we had finished with the museum, we left Friedrichshafen and carried along the lake. And then we cut out to an island called Lindau, which is a popular stop off for all the sightseeing boats that run around the island. We haven't quite got to Lindau yet. This is us by an orchard. Okay, Wes, carry on to the orchard. Yeah, this is just a change from the vines. We're into orchards now. And the next. These were some statues we passed on the way. Did we ever find out what they were?
No, they're weird.
No, they're weird. There were about 5 of them, all looking like that. And we never ever did find out what they were. There were a couple of people there. We asked them and they didn't know either.
Art installations.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, next. As we were cycling along, sometimes through the villages, down on the waterfront, there would be some lovely gardens. Villages were quite proud of their gardens on the front. Next. You also saw some wonderful domestic flowers along the hedgerows. Roses here, absolutely deluxe. And more vineyards with the poppies in the middle. And now we've arrived at Lindau, and we're sitting on the dock edge here among some buskers, a lot of tourists. I say there were a lot of ferry boats between all the major places like Constance, Bregenz, Friedrichshafen, all the bigger places that are around the island. There are constantly pleasure boats zipping across from one to the other, which people could stay on and stay on and go around the lake on it, so to speak. Or what they commonly did was hop from one to another, spend some time, and then hop somewhere else. But there was a constant stream of ferry boats bringing tourists from all the surrounding countries, as well as some from further apart. So if you ever want to explore Lake Constance, you really don't have to cycle all the way around it if you don't want to. You can just get on a boat. It was a lovely little old town, though, Lindau, and the back streets were really interesting to wander. Next. That again is one of the ferry boats going in and out. Looking behind, you see hills, and on the far side is going to be Bregenz, and we are going to be actually taking a lift up to the top of those hills, but that's for the next day. Next. These again now are wandering some of the old streets. You'll see the cobblestones and the wonderful colours. And originally, judging by the fish at the top of the picture, although it's a wine stube now, somewhere in its life, it must have been a fishmonger's. Next. Attractive wooden projected balconies from some of the buildings. Next. Again, narrow streets, colourful houses, clean as a whistle.
Old house.
Yes.
Very old.
Yeah.
Young Janet.
Yeah. Next. A beautiful town hall. Both the front and the back of this are beautifully decorated. This is the front side. The back side, which you can see, had an interesting little feature right in the centre of town here, a sandlot for the kids. Not something you'd expect to find just behind your city hall. But as I say, there was nowhere else much, I guess, for a playground on the island, so they just built one right behind the city hall. Next. And again, some beautiful black and white buildings. As I say, it was a joy to wander around this town. And funnily enough, the actual old part of the town that we're walking around wasn't crowded at all. Those mobs of people that got off the boats seemed to confine themselves primarily to the waterfront, where there were a lot of eating and drinking establishments. Next.
Helen, Helen,
Yep.
I'll just mention if we get cut off, just call back in. I'll have the whole session going again in a
Okay.
second or two. It just warned me about time, so
Okay, well, we're only at 20 minutes, so
yeah, hopefully we'll get at least a half hour.
yeah. Next. Again, this is just showing some of the wonderful painted buildings. Next. And again, the tower on the front. Probably a landmark for those coming in by boat. Next. Oh, this is a picture going back a century to around the early part of the century, when you can see
1909, yeah.
Eh?
1909 on the
1909, yes,
yeah.
but just over 100 years ago, with the Zeppelin flying overhead, the steamboats, pleasure craft everywhere. This has been a popular resort area as long as I say, people have been on the move in this part of the world. Next. As I mentioned, we overnighted not far away, as I mentioned, after we'd found our hotel. And then the following morning, we left. We had been in Germany those first 2 days, but now we've left Germany and we're in Austria, and we're at Bregenz, which is the biggest city in Austria on Lake Constance. And one of the features here is to ride the tramway up to the top. It's a telepherique cable car for views over the lake. It was a little bit hazy, so you can get the near view that I've got, but we couldn't get the more distant views. Next. At the top, they had basically a wildlife park, and this is one of the sheep, I would imagine, that they have in the Alps, and they were showing the animals of the Alps. Three of us, Lynn and Becky and myself, went for a wander around the animal enclosures, and Janet assailed the top, which was probably about 15 minutes above us, Janet.
I think it was 5, but far.
There was a microwave tower or something on the top above us. Next. As we cycled on after Bregenz, we had this next day, which is day 3 and day 4. They had, just before we'd started this cycle trip, they had some heavy rains. On this particular day, we did cycle through some water, but it wasn't until the following day that we were getting our feet wet. Anyway, we're cycling along, as I say, through very damp conditions. Although the weather, as you can see from the sky, is absolutely beautiful. Quite warm too. Next. And in the wetlands, had this rather attractive heron looking for his next meal.
Nice. Nice photo.
Yeah. Next.
Oh, God.
We crossed a bridge here across a river. As I say, we're just traveling through varied countryside here. We are in the process of moving out of Austria and into Switzerland. Next. Now, if we think covered bridges are unique to North America, we're wrong. They've had them in Europe, obviously, for quite a while. We didn't actually cross that bridge, though. Our trail is running along this wet area on this side. Next. Again, just showing the countryside that we're cycling through and the kind of cycle path we're on. Mostly, as I say, on dedicated cycling paths and very attractive green scenery. This on the left-hand side is actually a dike. Next.
Oh, God, that was awful.
Yes, this is where the wet became a little less than friendly. You had two choices. You could roll up your trousers as a cycler and get your feet wet, or you could do as the people on the far side were doing, which was taking off their lower garments to cycle through without any trousers or socks at all. We had about 3 puddles like this to go through. They were on their first and we were on our third. I think most of us had our party, we just resigned ourselves to wet feet. But that group, we had to warn them that they thought they only had this one to cross, but then they had about 2 more further down the trail. So they were going to be in and out of their shoes and trousers, not just once, but about 3 times. Next. As we were cycling along the lake, periodically we came to these buildings, which are actually old-fashioned bathhouses. They were very popular with the, I guess, the between the wars generations, that they could go out and have private changing rooms before dropping into the lake to swim. And then they had a clubhouse, I guess, for social activities.
I think it's a high-end restaurant, isn't it?
It is now, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Next.
It was high water too.
Yes.
Very high.
Yeah. And we just passed through some interesting little medieval villages. Next. As I say, some of the old villages are just so attractive. And of course, being Switzerland now, none of them were damaged at all in the war. Next. And again, as with the ones on the German side, on the opposite side, on the Swiss side, they also paint some of their buildings. We've got another Hindenburg, a blip. Our last day was a little on the damp side, not just underfoot, but overhead. It was the one day that we really didn't stop to do any significant sightseeing. We were just heading back to Constance on this day. The only challenge we had was finding somewhere for lunch. We cycled and cycled and cycled, and we're having trouble in the Swiss side. It isn't half as developed as the German side, where you were in and out of villages. And as I say, eventually we were saved by a gentleman from Constance who'd set up a Thai truck stop along the bike route. He came out each day to his truck stop and cooked up pad Thai and things like that for hungry bikers like us who'd been looking for somewhere for lunch. Next. Again, just showing the wildflowers that were growing. Next. Here's his truck stop. Well attended, as I say, right on the bike path. Next. Okay, we've now arrived in Austria. Are we going to be cut off at half an hour, Wes?
Yeah, yes, we are. We've got about just under 2
Well,
minutes.
how about I just take questions on the cycle bit and we'll start Austria on the next one.
I wanted to say, Helen, that your photos didn't represent all the bike traffic there was. That it was very, very crowded as far as bike traffic. But very manageable, and we managed to have, you know, moments of our own time, let's say. But it was a busy bike route, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing about it, you would never have to worry that if you didn't know the way or your bike broke down or anything of that sort,
Right.
there wouldn't be anybody there to help you.
Yeah.
For those of us like Wes and Norm, we were in that Portugal trip. You could have waited a long time for someone to come along and help you if we hadn't, as I say, had internal Wes and Norm to help with any challenges like flat tires that might occur. On this route, you would never have to wait. I doubt if you'd have to wait more than 5 minutes at any point before someone would come along. We also had, which was useful, Brad Ryson had given us the names